The water ran red as you stumbled onto the creek. Drag marks led into the forest where the sound of heavy breathing mixed with low guttural growls. It wasn't just a bear, it was a predator with no fear. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the story, I would like to ask for your support. Please subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to me and helps me a lot. I notice that many people watch the videos without subscribing, so please support me by subscribing. It means a lot to me and will help me greatly. I count on your support. Write in the comments which city you're watching from. We'll bring stories from near you. Click the like button and let's get to the case. Linda Harper stepped out onto her back porch, inhaling deeply as the crisp Montana air filled her lungs. The early morning sun cast a golden glow across her backyard, dew glistening on the grass and leaves. At 62, Linda still marveled at the beauty of Whitefish, the town she'd called home for the past 4 decades. Another beautiful day, she murmured to herself, stretching her arms above her head. The movement caused a twinge in her right shoulder, a reminder of her years as a nurse. Linda chuckled softly. Well, old girl, time to get to work. She made her way down the porch steps, her well-worn gardening shoes leaving imprints in the dewy grass. The vegetable patch, her pride and joy, lay just a few yards away. Linda had spent years perfecting it, coaxing an impressive variety of vegetables from the Montana soil. As she approached the garden, Linda's eyes swept over her prized squash plants. Their broad leaves spread out like green umbrellas, sheltering the developing fruit beneath. She knelt down, ignoring the protest from her knees, and gently lifted one of the leaves. Well, hello there, beautiful, she cooed at a particularly robust butternut squash. You're coming along nicely, aren't you? Linda reached for her gardening basket, pulling out a pair of pruning shears. She began to hum softly, an old folk tune her grandmother used to sing. The familiar melody, combined with the repetitive motions of pruning and tending, lulled her into a sense of peace. Time seemed to slip away as Linda lost herself in her work. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming her back as she moved from plant to plant. She was so engrossed in her task that at first she didn't notice the unnatural silence that had fallen over the yard. A twig snapped in the distance. Linda paused, her hand hovering over a squash blossom. She cocked her head, listening intently. The forest that bordered her property was usually alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. Now it was eerily quiet. Her heart skipped a beat as she scanned the forest's edge. The dense undergrowth revealed nothing out of the ordinary, but Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Years of living in bear country had honed her instincts. Hello? She called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Is someone there? No response came, but the bushes at the edge of her property rustled slightly. Linda's grip tightened on her pruning shears, though she knew they would be useless against any real threat. It's probably just the wind, she told herself, trying to calm her racing heart. Or maybe a deer. Nothing to worry about, Linda. But deep down, she knew it wasn't the wind. There was no breeze to speak of, the air as still as it had been all morning. And a deer would have bolted at the sound of her voice. Whatever was in those bushes was larger, and it wasn't scared of her. Linda slowly rose to her feet, her eyes never leaving the spot where she'd seen the movement. She took a cautious step backward, then another. Her mind raced through the bare safety tips she'd learned over the years. Make yourself look big. Make noise. Back away slowly. Don't run. Okay, she said loudly, trying to keep her voice steady. I don't know what you are, but I'm just going to head back to my house now. No need for any trouble. As if in response to her words, the bushes parted. Linda's breath caught in her throat as a massive grizzly bear emerged from the foliage. Its brown fur was matted in places, and its small dark eyes were fixed squarely on her. Linda felt her blood turn to ice. In all her years in Montana, she'd never been this close to a grizzly. She'd seen them from a distance, of course, and had even chased a black bear off her property once, but this was different. This was terror incarnate. The bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over Linda. It let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Linda's mind screamed at her to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "Nice bear," she whispered, her voice trembling. Good bear. You don't want to hurt me. I'm just a harmless old lady." The grizzly dropped back to all fours, its massive head swinging from side to side as it regarded her. Linda's eyes darted to the porch. It was only about 30 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. She knew she could never outrun the bear. Slowly, Linda began to edge backwards, keeping her eyes on the grizzly. Her heel caught on a rock and she stumbled slightly. The sudden movement seemed to trigger something in the bear. It let out a roar that shook Linda to her core and charged forward. "Oh God," Linda gasped, stumbling backward. Her trembling hands searched for anything she could use as a weapon. But all she had were her pruning shears. She gripped them tightly, knowing they would do little against the bear's thick hide and powerful muscles. The bear's paw swiped through the air, missing Linda's face by inches as she fell to the ground. The wind from the massive paw ruffled her hair, and she could smell the musky odor of the bear's fur. "Help!" Linda screamed, though she knew there was no one close enough to hear. "Somebody help me!" She began to crawl desperately towards her house, her fingers digging into the soft earth. The bear's growls grew louder behind her, spurring her on despite the pain in her joints and the terror gripping her heart. From inside the house, Linda heard a familiar bark. Buddy, her loyal golden retriever, had heard her cries. His frantic barking seemed to echo across the yard, momentarily drowning out the bear's growls. "Buddy!" Linda cried out, both in relief and fear for her dog. "Stay inside, boy. Stay safe." She glanced over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The bear was right behind her, its massive jaws open, saliva dripping from yellowed teeth. Linda could see every detail of its face, from the scars on its snout to the intelligence in its dark eyes. In that moment, Linda Harper, retired nurse and grandmother of 3, was certain she was about to die. The life she'd built, the family she loved, the peaceful retirement she'd planned, all of it was about to end in her own backyard, just feet away from the safety of her home. As the bear's shadow fell over her, Linda closed her eyes and thought of her grandchildren. She hoped they would remember her as she was in life, strong, loving, always ready with a warm hug and a plate of cookies, rather than as she was now, terrified and helpless on the ground. The last thing Linda saw before squeezing her eyes shut was the bear's massive paw, claws extended, descending towards her. The last thing she heard was Buddy's desperate barking from inside the house. And then the world exploded into pain and terror as the grizzly's attack began in earnest. The bear's hot, rancid breath washed over Linda as it stood on its hind legs, towering above her. The stench of rotting meat and wild musk filled her nostrils, making her gag. Time seemed to slow down as Linda stared up at the massive creature, its fur matted and eyes gleaming with primal hunger. "Please," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Please don't hurt me." The bear, of course, didn't respond. It swayed slightly on its hind legs, letting out a low growl that Linda felt in her very bones. She knew she had to move, had to do something, but fear had frozen her in place. Suddenly, the bear dropped back to all fours, and the spell was broken. Linda scrambled backward, her hands scrabbling in the dirt of her beloved garden. Her fingers brushed against something solid, a garden trowel she'd left out the day before. Linda's fingers closed around the handle of the trowel, gripping it tightly. It was a pitiful weapon against a grizzly, but it was all she had. She held it in front of her like a shield, her arm trembling. "Stay back!" she shouted, trying to make her voice sound as threatening as possible. "I'm warning you." The bear tilted its head, almost as if it was confused by her outburst. For a brief moment, Linda dared to hope that her show of bravado might work. But then the grizzly's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth the size of Linda's fingers. Linda stumbled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She took a step backward, then another, her eyes never leaving the bear. Inside the house, she could hear Buddy's frantic barking growing louder and more desperate. "Good boy, Buddy," Linda murmured, drawing strength from her loyal companion's voice. "Just stay inside. Stay safe." The bear took a lumbering step forward, matching Linda's retreat. Its claws dug into the soft earth of the garden, leaving deep gouges in the soil. Linda's heart ached at the destruction of her carefully tended plants, but she pushed the thought aside. There were more pressing concerns. Linda's back foot caught on a root, and she stumbled. Time seemed to slow down as she fell backward, her arms windmilling desperately. The bear saw its opportunity and lunged forward. A massive paw swiped through the air, missing Linda's face by mere inches as she fell to the ground. She felt the wind of its passage, saw the glint of sunlight on its deadly claws. Linda hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. "No!" Linda gasped, struggling to catch her breath. She rolled to the side just as the bear's other paw came down, its claws sinking into the earth where her head had been a moment before. Linda's survival instincts kicked in, overriding her terror. She began to crawl desperately towards her house, her fingers digging into the grass, pulling herself along. Each movement sent shockwaves of pain through her body, but she forced herself to keep going. "Help!" Linda screamed, her voice hoarse with fear. "Someone help me!" But she knew it was futile. Her nearest neighbors were too far away to hear, and even if they could, what could they do against a grizzly? Linda was on her own. The bear's growls grew louder behind her, spurring Linda to move faster. She could hear its heavy breathing, feel the vibrations of its footsteps through the ground. It was toying with her, she realized. If it wanted to, it could have killed her already. Linda's hand brushed against something smooth and round, a rock about the size of a softball. Without thinking, she grabbed it and rolled onto her back, facing the bear. The grizzly loomed over her, its massive head blocking out the sun. Saliva dripped from its jaws, splattering on Linda's shirt. In that moment, looking into the bear's dark, intelligent eyes, Linda saw her death reflected back at her. With a desperate cry, Linda hurled the rock at the bear's face. It struck the grizzly on the snout, eliciting a roar of pain and surprise. The bear reared back, shaking its head in confusion. Linda seized the opportunity. She scrambled to her feet and ran towards the house, ignoring the screaming pain in her muscles. The porch was just yards away now. If she could make it inside, she'd be safe. "Buddy!" Linda yelled as she ran. "Buddy, I'm coming." Behind her, she heard the bear recover and give chase. Its thunderous footsteps spurred her on, lending speed to her tired legs. Linda's lungs burned, her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't dare slow down. She reached the porch steps and began to climb, taking them two at a time. Her foot caught on the edge of a step and she fell forward, slamming her knee hard against the wood. Linda cried out in pain but forced herself up, driven by the sound of the bear right behind her. Linda reached for the doorknob, her fingers closing around the cool metal. She turned it frantically, pushing the door open. Buddy was right there, barking furiously, his whole body vibrating with the force of his cries. "Good boy," Linda gasped, reaching for him. "Good." Her words were cut off by a searing pain in her back. The bear's claws tore into her flesh, ripping through her shirt and skin alike. Linda screamed in agony, certain that death was upon her. With the last of her strength, Linda threw herself through the doorway. She landed hard on the floor of her entryway, the impact sending fresh waves of pain through her battered body. Buddy was there in an instant, standing over her protectively, his barks now interspersed with vicious growls. The bear's massive head appeared in the doorway, its hot breath filling the small space. It snapped its jaws, the sound like a steel trap closing. Buddy lunged forward, his teeth bared, placing himself between Linda and the bear. "Buddy, no!" Linda cried, reaching for her dog. But Buddy stood his ground, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by fierce protectiveness. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The bear's eyes darted between Linda and Buddy, as if weighing its options. Linda held her breath, her hand buried in Buddy's fur, feeling his rapid heartbeat. Then, miraculously, the bear backed away. Maybe it was Buddy's ferocious barking, or perhaps the unfamiliar confines of the house deterred it. Whatever the reason, the grizzly retreated, its heavy footsteps moving away from the door. With trembling hands, Linda reached up and slammed the door shut, turning the lock with a satisfying click. She collapsed back onto the floor, her body shaking with adrenaline and pain. "We did it, Buddy," Linda whispered, hugging her dog close. "We made it." Buddy whined softly, licking Linda's face. She could feel the warmth of her own blood soaking through her shirt, the pain in her back a constant throbbing reminder of how close she'd come to death. Outside, she could hear the bear moving around, its heavy footsteps circling the house. Linda knew she wasn't out of danger yet. She needed help, and she needed it soon. With great effort, she began to drag herself towards the phone, leaving a trail of blood on her pristine hardwood floor. As Linda reached for the phone, her vision began to blur. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Buddy's concerned face, his brown eyes filled with worry. Then, mercifully, everything went black. Linda's eyes fluttered open, her vision blurry and unfocused. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or what had happened. Then the pain hit her, a searing, throbbing agony that radiated from her back and shoulder. The memories came flooding back in a rush of terror and adrenaline. "The bear," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. Buddy's concerned whine brought her fully back to consciousness. The loyal golden retriever was lying next to her, his warm body pressed against her side. Linda reached out with a shaky hand to stroke his fur, drawing comfort from his presence. "Good boy," she murmured. "You saved me, didn't you?" Buddy's tail thumped weakly against the floor in response. Linda tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. She glanced down at the floor, seeing the small pool of blood that had formed beneath her. The sight made her stomach churn. "Okay, Linda," she said to herself, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to get up. You need to call for help." With gritted teeth, Linda pushed herself into a sitting position, leaning heavily against the wall. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body, and she had to fight to stay conscious. She could feel the warm trickle of blood down her back, soaking into her torn shirt. Suddenly, a low, rumbling growl from outside made her freeze. The bear was still there, circling the house. Linda's heart began to race as she realized her ordeal was far from over. "It's okay," she whispered to Buddy, who had started to growl softly. "We're safe in here. It can't get us." But even as she said the words, Linda heard a new sound, the screech of claws against wood. The bear was scratching at the walls of the house, testing for weaknesses. Each scrape sent shivers down Linda's spine. With renewed urgency, Linda began to crawl towards the phone on the side table. Every movement was agony, but she forced herself to keep going. Buddy stayed close, alternating between worried whines and protective growls. "Almost there," Linda panted, reaching out for the phone. Her fingers brushed against the handset, but it was just out of reach. She stretched further, biting back a cry of pain as the movement pulled at her wounds. Finally, her hand closed around the phone. Linda pulled it towards her, fumbling with the buttons. Her vision was blurring again, and she had to blink hard to focus on the numbers. 911, she mumbled, her fingers leaving smears of blood on the keypad. "Just need to call 911. The phone began to ring, each second feeling like an eternity. Outside, the bear's scratching grew more insistent. Linda could hear the wood splintering, and she prayed the old cabin would hold. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm, professional voice came through the line. "Help," Linda gasped. "There's a bear. It attacked me. I'm hurt. It's still here." "Ma'am, can you tell me your location?" the operator asked, her voice taking on a note of urgency. Linda rattled off her address, her words slurring slightly as shock began to set in. "Please hurry," she added. "I don't know how long the house will hold. We're dispatching emergency services now," the operator assured her. "Can you get to a secure room? Away from any windows or doors?" Linda looked around, assessing her options. The bedroom was down the hall, but it felt miles away in her current state. I don't know if I can move that far," she admitted. "That's okay," the operator said soothingly. "Just stay where you are. Can you tell me about your injuries?" As Linda began to describe the gashes on her back, a loud crash from the back of the house made her jump. Buddy leapt to his feet, barking furiously. "Oh God," Linda whispered, her voice trembling. "I think it's breaking in. It's coming for me." "Ma'am, stay calm," the operator said, but Linda could hear the tension in her voice. "Help is on the way. Is there anything you can use to defend yourself?" Linda's eyes darted around the room, landing on the fireplace poker leaning against the hearth. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "There's a poker," she said, "but I don't know if I can reach it. If you can do so safely, try to arm yourself," the operator advised. "But don't take any unnecessary risks. Your priority is to stay safe until help arrives." Another crash echoed through the house, closer this time. Linda could hear wood splintering, the bear's growls growing louder. Adrenaline surged through her body, momentarily overriding the pain. "I have to move," she told the operator. "It's coming. Be careful," the operator cautioned. "Don't hang up, I'm staying on the line with you." Linda began to drag herself across the floor, leaving a smear of blood in her wake. Buddy stayed close, his body tense and alert. The phone dangled from Linda's hand, the operator's voice a tinny whisper of encouragement. As Linda reached for the poker, a final crash announced the bear's entry into the house. She could hear its heavy breathing, the scrape of its claws on the wooden floor. It was in the kitchen, just around the corner from where she lay. With trembling hands, Linda grasped the poker. Its weight was reassuring. Even though she knew it would do little against the grizzly, she pulled herself into a sitting position, her back against the wall, and held the poker out in front of her like a spear. "Buddy," she whispered. "Go hide, boy, go on." But the loyal dog refused to leave her side. He stood in front of Linda, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The bear appeared in the doorway, its massive form filling the frame. Blood matted its fur. Linda's blood, she realized with a jolt of horror. Its small dark eyes fixed on her, filled with primal hunger and rage. "Stay back!" Linda shouted, her voice cracking with fear. She brandished the poker, trying to make herself look as threatening as possible. The bear paused, seeming to assess the situation. For a moment, Linda dared to hope that it might retreat. But then it let out a roar that shook the windows and charged forward. Everything happened in a blur. Buddy leapt at the bear, his jaws snapping. The grizzly swatted him aside with a massive paw, sending the dog crashing into the wall with a yelp of pain. "Buddy!" Linda screamed. She thrust the poker forward as the bear turned its attention back to her. The metal tip scraped against the bear's hide, drawing a thin line of blood. The bear reared up, towering over Linda. She looked up into its savage face, certain that her last moments had arrived. She thought of her children, her grandchildren, all the people she loved. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Just then, a new sound cut through the chaos. Sirens. Growing louder by the second. The bear's head swiveled towards the noise, its ears flattening against its skull. "That's right," Linda said, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in her throat. "The cavalry's coming, you bastard." The bear let out a low growl, clearly agitated by the approaching sirens. It took a step back, then another. Linda held her breath, hardly daring to believe what was happening. With a final rumbling growl, the grizzly turned and lumbered out of the room. Linda could hear it moving through the house, back towards the hole it had created. The sound of splintering wood marked its exit. Linda slumped against the wall, the poker falling from her numb fingers. Buddy limped over to her, whining softly. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "We did it, boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We survived." As the sirens grew louder, signaling the approach of help, Linda closed her eyes. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her weak and shaky. But she was alive. Against all odds, she had faced down a grizzly bear and lived to tell the tale. The last thing Linda heard before unconsciousness claimed her was the sound of car doors slamming and voices shouting. Help had arrived. She was safe at last. Linda Harper lay on the cold hardwood floor of her living room, her body racked with pain and tremors. The world around her seemed to fade in and out of focus, the room spinning even though she was completely still. She could feel Buddy's warm presence beside her, the loyal dog's gentle whimpers, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. "It's okay, boy," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're safe now." But even as she spoke the words, Linda wasn't entirely sure they were true. Her ears strained to catch any sound of the bear outside, half expecting to hear its heavy footsteps or menacing growl at any moment. The house creaked and settled, each noise making her flinch. Buddy suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. A moment later, Linda heard it too, the distant wail of sirens growing steadily louder. Relief washed over her like a wave, bringing with it a fresh surge of pain as her battered body relaxed slightly. "Help is coming," she murmured, more to herself than to Buddy. "Just hang on a little longer," As the sirens drew nearer, Linda tried to take stock of her injuries. Her back felt like it was on fire, the bear's claws having left deep gashes that still oozed blood. Her right shoulder, already weak from years of wear and tear, throbbed with a pain unlike anything she'd experienced before. She suspected it was dislocated. The sound of car doors slamming and urgent voices filled the air outside. Buddy let out a series of sharp barks, alerting the rescuers to their location. "In here," Linda called out, her voice stronger now that help was near. "We're in here." The front door burst open and 2 paramedics rushed in, their eyes quickly scanning the room before landing on Linda and Buddy. "Ma'am, are you Linda Harper?" one of them asked, kneeling beside her. Linda nodded weakly. "Yes, that's me." "The bear, is it gone?" The second paramedic was already examining her wounds. "Wildlife control is here, ma'am. They're securing the area. You're safe now." As the paramedics worked, asking her questions and gently tending to her injuries, Linda found herself recounting the terrifying ordeal. The words spilled out of her in a rush, as if by speaking them aloud she could somehow make sense of what had happened. "I was just in my garden," she explained, wincing as one of the paramedics cleaned the gashes on her back. "It came out of nowhere. I tried to run, but it was so fast." "You're incredibly brave, Mrs. Harper," the paramedic said, his voice filled with admiration. "Not many people could have survived an encounter like that." Linda shook her head. "I didn't do anything special, I couldn't let it hurt Buddy." As if on cue, Buddy let out a soft whine. A wildlife officer had entered the room and was trying to coax the dog away so the paramedics could work more freely. "It's okay, boy," Linda called out. "Go with the nice officer, I'll be all right." With obvious reluctance, Buddy allowed himself to be led away. Though he kept looking back at Linda, his eyes filled with concern. The paramedics carefully lifted Linda onto a stretcher. As they carried her out of the house, she got her first look at the scene outside. Several police cars and a wildlife control van were parked in her driveway. Officers were combing the area, their weapons at the ready. "The bear," Linda said, suddenly remembering. "It's still out there. It could hurt someone else." One of the wildlife officers approached the stretcher. "Don't worry, ma'am. We've set up traps and we're tracking it. It won't get far." As they loaded her into the ambulance, Linda caught sight of her neighbor, Mrs. Johansson, standing at the edge of her property. The elderly woman's face was pale with shock. "Linda," Mrs. Johansson called out. "Oh my God, are you all right?" Linda managed a weak wave. "I'll be fine, Edna. Can you keep an eye on Buddy for me?" Before Mrs. Johansson could respond, the ambulance doors closed and they were on their way to the hospital. The paramedic in the back with her started an IV and began asking her more questions about the attack. "Can you tell me exactly what happened, Mrs. Harper?" he asked gently. Linda closed her eyes, the memories washing over her. "I was in my garden tending to my squash. It was so quiet. I should have known something was wrong. The bear had just appeared out of the woods. I tried to back away slowly, like they always tell you to do, but it charged." Her voice trailed off as she remembered the terror of those moments. The paramedic patted her hand reassuringly. "You did everything right, Mrs. Harper. Bears don't usually attack humans unless they're surprised or feel threatened. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Linda nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. "I should have been more careful. I've lived here for years. I know there are bears in the area. I just never thought." "This isn't your fault," the paramedic said firmly. "What matters is that you survived. That's something to be proud of." As the ambulance sped towards the hospital, Linda found herself drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain medication they'd given her was starting to take effect, dulling the sharp agony to a more manageable ache. In her more lucid moments, Linda couldn't help but replay the attack in her mind. The bear's hot breath, its powerful claws, the terror of thinking she was about to die. It all seemed surreal now, like a nightmare she couldn't quite shake off. She thought about her family, her children who lived in different states, her grandchildren who loved visiting her in the summer. What would they say when they found out? Would they insist she move away from Whitefish, away from the home she loved? The ambulance pulled up to the emergency room entrance, and a flurry of activity ensued. Linda was wheeled into the hospital, bright lights and concerned faces flashing above her. "Bear attack victim," she heard someone say. "Multiple lacerations. possible dislocated shoulder. As they transferred her to a hospital bed, Linda caught sight of her reflection in a nearby window. Her face was pale and drawn, streaked with dirt and tears. Her clothes were torn and bloodied. She hardly recognized herself. A doctor appeared at her bedside, his face serious but kind. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Dr. Stevenson. We're going to take good care of you, all right? Can you tell me where the pain is worst?" Linda tried to focus, to push through the fog of medication and shock. "My back," she managed, "and my right shoulder. I think it might be dislocated." Dr. Stevenson nodded. "We'll take a look at that right away. You're going to need some stitches, and we'll run some scans to check for internal injuries, but from what I can see, you're one tough lady, Mrs. Harper. You're going to be okay." As the medical team worked around her, cleaning her wounds and preparing her for tests, Linda found herself thinking about her garden, the squash she'd been tending, the tomatoes that were almost ripe, the herbs she'd planned to harvest that week. It all seemed so mundane now, so far removed from the life and death struggle she'd just endured. Yet as she lay there, surrounded by the beeping of machines and the hushed voices of medical professionals, Linda felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She had survived. Against all odds, she had faced down one of nature's most fearsome predators and lived to tell the tale. As they wheeled her towards the imaging department for her scans, Linda made a silent promise to herself. She would recover, she would go home, and she would tend her garden again, bear or no bear. After all, she was Linda Harper, retired nurse, grandmother, and now bear attack survivor. And she wasn't about to let one terrifying experience define the rest of her life. The rhythmic beeping of hospital machines filled the air as Linda Harper slowly opened her eyes. The stark white ceiling and antiseptic smell confirmed she was still in the hospital. As consciousness fully returned, so did the memories of the bear attack, vivid and terrifying. A gentle knock on the door drew her attention. "Mrs. Harper, are you up for a visitor?" a nurse asked, poking her head in. Linda nodded weakly. "Yes, that's fine." The door opened wider, revealing a tall man in a khaki uniform. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Officer Mike Tanner from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. I hope you're feeling up to answering a few questions about the incident." "Of course," Linda replied, wincing as she tried to sit up straighter. "Anything I can do to help?" Officer Tanner pulled up a chair beside her bed, a notepad in hand. His face was grim as he studied the bandages visible beneath Linda's hospital gown. "First off, how are you feeling, ma'am?" Linda managed a weak smile. "Like I went 10 rounds with a grizzly and lost. But I'm alive, and that's what matters." The officer nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You're one tough lady, Mrs. Harper. Now can you walk me through what happened? Every detail helps." Linda took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in her ribs. She recounted the events of that morning, the peaceful gardening, the sudden silence, and then the terrifying appearance of the bear. As she spoke, Officer Tanner listened intently, jotting down notes. "You mentioned the bear seemed to come out of nowhere," he said when she finished. "Had you noticed any signs of bear activity in the area before the attack?" Linda shook her head. "No, nothing unusual. I've lived there for years, and while we know there are bears in the area, I'd never had any close encounters before." Officer Tanner's pen scratched across his notepad. "And you're certain it was a grizzly? Not a black bear?" "Oh yes," Linda said, a shudder running through her. "It was massive, with that distinctive hump on its shoulders. I've seen black bears before, but this was something else entirely." The officer nodded grimly. "That matches what we found at the scene. The claw marks on your house and the prints in your garden are definitely from a grizzly, a big one too." Linda's heart raced at the mention of her home. "My house? How bad is the damage?" "It's substantial," Officer Tanner admitted, "but nothing that can't be repaired. Your insurance should cover it." A thought suddenly struck Linda. "My dog, Buddy. Is he okay?" "He tried to protect me." The officer's face softened. "Your dog is fine, Mrs. Harper. A bit shaken up, but no serious injuries. Your neighbor, Mrs. Johansson, is looking after him." Relief washed over Linda. At least Buddy was safe. Officer Tanner leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mrs. Harper, I need to ask, was there anything that might have attracted the bear? Any food left outside, bird feeders, that sort of thing?" Linda shook her head emphatically. No, nothing like that, I know better. The only thing out there was my vegetable garden, but it's been there for years without any problems. The officer made another note. Sometimes even something as simple as ripe fruit can attract bears. We'll take a closer look at the area. As if on cue, Officer Tanner's radio crackled to life. He listened for a moment, then turned back to Linda, his face grim. Mrs. Harper, I'm afraid I have some news. The bear has been spotted near your property again. Linda's heart leapt into her throat. What? But I thought, aren't you trying to catch it? We are, Officer Tanner assured her. We've set up traps around your property and in the surrounding area, but this bear, it's proving to be quite elusive. He stood up, clipping his radio back to his belt. I'm going to head back out there now. We're doing everything we can to ensure the safety of the community. As he turned to leave, Linda called out, Wait, what will happen to the bear when you catch it? Officer Tanner paused at the door. That depends on a lot of factors, Mrs. Harper. Given the severity of the attack, relocation might not be an option. But let's focus on catching it first, all right? After the officer left, Linda lay back in her bed, her mind whirling. The bear was still out there, still a threat to her neighbors, her community, and possibly facing death because of their encounter. Despite everything, the thought made her heart heavy. The next few days passed in a blur of medical examinations, pain medications, and a steady stream of visitors. Linda's children flew in from out of state, their faces etched with worry. They talked in hushed tones about her moving away, about the dangers of living so close to the wilderness. Linda listened but said little. This was her home, bear or no bear. On the third day, as Linda was beginning to feel more like herself, Officer Tanner returned. His face was etched with lines of fatigue, but there was a glimmer of relief in his eyes. Mrs. Harper, he said, settling into the chair by her bed. We've got some news. We caught the bear last night. Linda's breath caught in her throat. You did? Is it the right one? Officer Tanner nodded. We're pretty sure. It's a large male grizzly, and its paw prints match those we found in your yard. Plus, it had some of your blood on its claws. Linda shuddered at the thought. What will happen to it now? The officer sighed heavily. Given the severity of the attack and the bear's continued presence in a residential area, the decision has been made to euthanize it. Oh, Linda said softly, surprised by the pang of sadness she felt. I see. Noticing her expression, Officer Tanner leaned forward. Mrs. Harper, I know this might sound strange, but it's not uncommon for attack victims to feel conflicted about the fate of the animal. Remember, you did nothing wrong. The bear was following its instincts, but we can't risk it attacking someone else. Linda nodded slowly. I understand. It's a lot to process. Of course it is, Officer Tanner said kindly. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's going to take time to come to terms with everything. As the officer prepared to leave, he paused. Mrs. Harper, I have to say, your courage throughout this ordeal has been remarkable. The way you fought back, protected your dog. Well, let's just say you've become something of a local hero. Linda felt her cheeks flush. I'm no hero, officer. I just did what I had to do to survive. And that's exactly what makes you a hero. He replied with a smile. Take care, Mrs. Harper. And don't hesitate to call if you need anything. After Officer Tanner left, Linda sat in silence, staring out the window at the Montana landscape she loved so much. The bear was gone. The immediate danger passed. But she knew the real challenge was just beginning, learning to feel safe in her own home again, to not jump at every shadow or rustle in the bushes. As she watched the sun setting over the distant mountains, Linda made a decision. She would go home. She would replant her garden, and she would face her fears one day at a time. After all, she was a survivor, and survivors, she knew, don't give up. 2 weeks after the bear attack, Linda Harper stood at the threshold of her newly repaired back door, her hand resting on the doorknob. The morning sun cast a warm glow over her backyard, but the once inviting scene now filled her with apprehension. Come on, Linda, she muttered to herself. It's just your garden. You've done this 1,000 times. Buddy whined softly beside her, sensing her unease. Linda reached down to scratch behind his ears, drawing comfort from his presence. It's okay, boy, we're safe now. Taking a deep breath, Linda turned the knob and stepped outside. The crisp Montana air filled her lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and wildflowers. For a moment, she could almost pretend that nothing had changed. But as she made her way down the porch steps, every muscle in her body tensed. Her eyes darted from side to side, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The stitches in her back pulled uncomfortably, a constant reminder of how close she had come to death. Linda forced herself to keep moving, heading towards her beloved vegetable patch. The garden, once her pride and joy, now lay in ruins. Trampled plants and churned earth bore testament to the violence that had unfolded here. Kneeling down, Linda ran her fingers through the soil. "Oh, my poor babies," she murmured, lifting a crushed tomato plant. "What are we going to do with you?" As she began to clear away the debris, Linda found herself hyper-aware of every sound. A branch creaking in the wind made her freeze. A squirrel scampering across the lawn sent her heart racing. Even Buddy's occasional barks at passing birds made her jump. "Get a grip, Linda," she chastised herself. "The bear is gone, you're safe." But no matter how many times she repeated those words, she couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The attack had shattered her sense of security, leaving her feeling exposed and on edge. As the morning wore on, Linda slowly began to relax. The familiar routine of gardening, of getting her hands dirty and nurturing new life, started to work its magic. She found herself humming softly as she replanted a row of squash, imagining how they would look in a few weeks' time. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the nearby woods. Linda's head snapped up, her body tensing instantly. Buddy, who had been dozing in the sun, leapt to his feet with a growl. "Hello?" Linda called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her. Linda's eyes scanned the forest's edge, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it happening again? Had another bear found its way into her yard? "Buddy, come," she whispered, slowly backing towards the house. The dog obeyed, staying close to her side. Just as they reached the porch steps, a figure emerged from the trees. Linda let out a startled cry, stumbling backward. "Whoa, easy there, Mrs. Harper," a familiar voice called out. "It's just me, Officer Tanner." Relief washed over Linda as she recognized the wildlife officer. He approached cautiously, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm so sorry to startle you," Officer Tanner said, his face etched with concern. "I was just doing a routine check of the area. Are you all right?" Linda nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. "Yes, I'm fine. Just a bit jumpy, I suppose." Officer Tanner's eyes softened with understanding. "That's perfectly normal, Mrs. Harper. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's going to take time to feel safe again." They made their way to the porch, where Linda sank gratefully into a chair. Her legs felt weak, and she realized she was shaking slightly. "How are you really doing?" Officer Tanner asked, taking a seat across from her. Linda sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. I'm trying, but it's hard. Every little noise, every shadow, I keep thinking it's happening all over again." The officer nodded sympathetically. "That's a common reaction to trauma. Have you considered talking to someone about it? There are support groups for animal attack survivors." "I don't know," Linda said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I'm ready to relive it all again." "You don't have to decide right away," Officer Tanner assured her. "But it might help to connect with others who've been through similar experiences." As they sat in companionable silence, a low growl echoed from the forest. Linda tensed immediately, her eyes wide with fear. Officer Tanner held up a hand. "It's okay, Mrs. Harper. That's just a moose. They're pretty common in this area, especially this time of year." Linda let out a shaky laugh. "A moose, of course. I used to love hearing them. I used to. Now every sound is a potential threat," Officer Tanner finished for her. "It's going to take time, Mrs. Harper, but you're strong. You survived a bear attack. You can survive this too." As the officer prepared to leave, he paused at the steps. "Oh, I almost forgot. We've set up some new warning systems in the area. Motion sensors that will alert us if any large animals come too close to residential properties. Would you like us to install one here?" Linda considered for a moment. Part of her wanted to say yes, to grasp at anything that might make her feel safer. But another part, the part that had always loved the wildness of Montana, hesitated. I don't think so, she said finally. At least not right now. I need to learn to trust my own instincts again, but thank you for the offer. Officer Tanner nodded approvingly. I think that's a wise decision, Mrs. Harper. You're facing your fears head-on. That takes real courage. After the officer left, Linda turned back to her garden. The sun was high in the sky now, warming her back as she knelt in the soil. She knew the fear wouldn't disappear overnight. It would take time, patience, and a lot of small steps like this one. But as she planted a new row of tomatoes, Linda felt a small spark of her old confidence returning. She was Linda Harper, after all. She had faced down a grizzly bear and lived to tell the tale. She could face this too. As the day wore on, Linda found herself settling into a rhythm. The familiar motions of gardening, the feel of soil between her fingers, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It all began to soothe her frayed nerves. But just as she was beginning to relax, a shadow fell across her. Linda's heart leapt into her throat as she spun around, half expecting to see the massive form of a bear looming over her. Instead, she found herself face to face with her neighbor, Mrs. Johansson. "Oh, Linda!" Mrs. Johansson exclaimed, her hand flying to her chest. "I'm so sorry, dear. I didn't mean to startle you." Linda let out a shaky breath, forcing a smile onto her face. "It's all right, Edna. I'm just a little jumpy these days." Mrs. Johansson's face softened with sympathy. "Of course you are, dear. After what you've been through. Well, I can't even imagine." As they chatted, Linda found herself recounting the attack once again. It was becoming a familiar story now, one she had told to doctors, officers, and well-meaning visitors. But no matter how many times she told it, she couldn't shake the visceral fear that came with the memories. "You know," Mrs. Johansson said as Linda finished her tale, "my late husband used to say that the best way to overcome fear is to face it head-on. Maybe what you need is to get back out there. Really out there, I mean, in the woods." Linda felt a chill run down her spine at the mere thought. "I don't know, Edna. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." Her neighbor patted her hand gently. "No one's saying you have to do it today, dear. But someday, when you're ready, don't let one bad experience take away something you love." As Mrs. Johansson bid her goodbye, Linda pondered her words. The idea of venturing into the woods filled her with dread. But at the same time, she felt a tiny flicker of longing. She had always loved hiking, always felt at peace among the towering pines and babbling brooks. That night, as Linda prepared for bed, she found herself pausing at the window. The forest beyond her backyard was a dark, looming presence. But as she stared out into the night, she realized something. The fear was still there, yes, but alongside it was something else. A determination, a resolve. She might not be ready to hike those trails again tomorrow, or next week, or even next month. But someday, she would. Someday, she would reclaim her love for the wilderness that had been her home for so long. As she crawled into bed, Buddy curling up at her feet, Linda made a promise to herself. She would take it one day at a time, one step at a time, and eventually, she would find her way back to the Linda Harper who had never let fear hold her back. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Linda Harper was a survivor, and survivors, she knew, never gave up. A week after Linda's first venture back into her garden, she awoke to the sound of car doors slamming outside her house. Frowning, she made her way to the window and peeked out, her eyes widening at the sight before her. 3 news vans were parked in her driveway, their logos emblazoned on the sides. Reporters and camera operators milled about, setting up equipment and chatting amongst themselves. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Linda muttered, running a hand through her hair. She had known this day would come eventually, but she had hoped for more time to prepare. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Linda took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and went to answer it. A young woman with a microphone stood on her porch, a cameraman behind her. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Sarah Johnson from KPX-TV. We were hoping to get an interview about your recent bear encounter." Linda hesitated, her hand on the door frame. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that, Ms. Johnson." The reporter's smile didn't waver. "We understand this is a sensitive topic, Mrs. Harper. but your story has captured the community's attention. People want to hear from you, to know you're okay." Before Linda could respond, another voice called out from behind the news crew. "Linda, are you all right?" Linda peered around the reporter to see her neighbor, Mrs. Johansson, hurrying up the path. The elderly woman shot a disapproving look at the news crew as she approached. "I'm fine, Edna," Linda assured her. She turned back to the reporter. "Look, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not comfortable doing an interview right now." Sarah Johnson's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "Perhaps just a short statement then? The community is very concerned about bear safety in the wake of your attack." Linda felt a surge of guilt at those words. She did have a responsibility to warn others, didn't she? To share what she had learned? "All right," she said finally. "I'll answer a few questions, but not here. There's a town meeting tonight at the community center. I'll speak there." The reporter beamed. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. We'll be there." As the news crew retreated to their van, Mrs. Johansson turned to Linda with concern. "Are you sure about this, dear? You don't owe them anything." Linda nodded, surprising herself with her resolve. "I'm sure. If my story can help keep others safe, I need to tell it." That evening, Linda found herself standing at the podium in the Whitefish Community Center. The room was packed, filled with familiar faces and strangers alike. Camera crews lined the back wall, their lenses trained on her. Taking a deep breath, Linda began to speak. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Harper, and as many of you know, I recently survived a grizzly bear attack in my own backyard." A hush fell over the room as Linda recounted her harrowing experience. She described the initial encounter, the desperate escape, and the lingering fear that still haunted her. "But I'm not here to scare you," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm here to remind you that we share this beautiful land with wild creatures. We need to be respectful, cautious, and prepared." As Linda spoke about bear safety measures and the importance of community awareness, she noticed a mix of reactions in the audience. Many nodded in agreement, their faces etched with concern and sympathy. But others seemed skeptical, their brows furrowed in doubt. After she finished, the mayor opened the floor for questions. A middle-aged man in a flannel shirt stood up. "Mrs. Harper, don't you think you're overreacting a bit? Bears have always been around here, and attacks are rare." Linda felt a flash of anger, but she took a deep breath before responding. "It's true that attacks are rare, sir, but when they happen, they're devastating. I'm not suggesting we live in fear, but rather that we live with awareness." Another resident, a young mother holding a toddler, spoke up. "I'm scared to let my kids play outside now. What if a bear comes into our yard?" "I understand your fear," Linda said gently, "but education is key. Teach your children about bear safety, make noise when you're outside, and keep your yard free of attractants. We can coexist safely if we're smart about it." As the questions continued, Linda found herself growing more confident in her responses. She shared practical tips, debunked myths, and emphasized the importance of respecting wildlife. However, as the meeting wore on, she couldn't help but notice a few skeptical looks and whispered conversations. During a brief pause, she overheard a snippet of conversation from nearby. Probably provoked the bear somehow. They don't just attack for no reason. The words stung, and Linda felt a surge of self-doubt. Had she done something to provoke the attack? Was she somehow to blame? Pushing the thoughts aside, she refocused on the questions at hand. By the time the meeting ended, Linda felt drained but oddly satisfied. She had faced her fears and shared her story, hoping it would make a difference. As people filed out of the community center, many stopped to thank Linda or offer words of support. But she couldn't shake the memory of those skeptical looks and whispered doubts. Officer Tanner approached her as she gathered her things. "You did well up there, Mrs. Harper. Your story will help a lot of people stay safe." Linda managed a small smile. "I hope so. But I couldn't help noticing, not everyone seemed convinced." The wildlife officer nodded sympathetically. "That's always the case with these things. Some people won't believe it until it happens to them or someone they know. But trust me, your words made an impact." As Linda made her way home, escorted by Mrs. Johansson, who had insisted on driving her, she felt a mix of emotions. Pride in her ability to stand up and share her story. Frustration at those who dismissed her experience, and a lingering fear that still whispered in the back of her mind. "You know," Mrs. Johansson said as they pulled into Linda's driveway, "I think you're very brave, dear. Not just for surviving the attack, but for speaking out like this." Linda felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, Edna. I just hope it makes a difference." As she watched her neighbor drive away, Linda turned to face her house. The porch light cast a warm glow and she could see Buddy's silhouette in the window, waiting for her. The forest beyond her backyard was a dark presence, but for the first time since the attack, Linda didn't feel overwhelmed by fear as she looked at it. Instead, she felt a quiet determination. She had survived, she had spoken out, and she would continue to live her life. As interest in her story began to wane in the following days, Linda found herself grappling with mixed emotions. On one hand, she was relieved to no longer be the center of attention. On the other, she worried that people would forget the important safety lessons she had tried to impart. But life in Whitefish began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Linda continued to tend her garden, each day growing a little more comfortable in her own backyard. And while the fear didn't disappear entirely, it became more manageable, a quiet caution rather than a paralyzing terror. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, Linda realized something. Her bear encounter had changed her. Yes, but it hadn't broken her. She was still Linda Harper, gardener, grandmother, and now reluctant local expert on bear safety. And she would continue to share her story, quietly and persistently, in the hopes of keeping her community safe. 6 weeks had passed since the bear attack, and Linda Harper stood at the edge of her newly restored vegetable garden. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. Linda took a deep breath, savoring the familiar sense of earth and growing things. "Well, my lovelies," she murmured to her plants, "shall we see how you're doing today?" With trembling hands, Linda knelt down beside her prized squash plants. The new seedlings she'd planted after the attack were coming along nicely, their broad leaves reaching towards the sky. She gently lifted one of the leaves, checking for any signs of pests or disease. As she worked, Linda found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of gardening. The repetitive motions of weeding, pruning, and tending soothed her frayed nerves. For a few precious moments, she almost felt like her old self again, but then a twig snapped in the nearby woods, and reality came crashing back. Linda's head snapped up, her heart pounding in her chest. Her eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Buddy, who had been dozing nearby, was instantly alert, his ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his throat. "It's okay, boy," Linda whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring the dog or herself. "It's probably just a squirrel or something." But as the seconds ticked by and no further sounds came from the forest, Linda found herself unable to shake off the fear that had gripped her. The peaceful mood of moments ago was shattered, replaced by a familiar anxiety that made her palms sweat and her breath come in short gasps. "This is ridiculous," Linda muttered to herself, struggling to her feet. "You can't keep jumping at every little sound, Linda." Yet even as she chided herself, Linda found her feet carrying her swiftly back towards the house. Buddy trotted at her heels, still on high alert. As they reached the porch, Linda's trembling hands fumbled with the doorknob before finally managing to wrench it open. Once inside, Linda leaned against the closed door, her heart still racing. She closed her eyes, trying to slow her breathing. "You're safe," she told herself firmly. "The bear is gone. You're safe." But the words rang hollow in the quiet house. Linda knew that while the specific bear that had attacked her was gone, others still roamed the forests around Whitefish. The threat, however unlikely, was still very real. As her panic slowly subsided, Linda made her way to the kitchen window. From here, she had a clear view of her backyard and the forest beyond. She scanned the tree line again, half expecting to see a massive grizzly emerging from the shadows. Instead, her eyes widened as she spotted movement at the edge of her property. A large form was ambling through her yard, its brown fur gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Oh my God," Linda breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Is that—" It was indeed a bear, though Linda couldn't be sure if it was a grizzly or a black bear from this distance. The animal moved with a casual grace, seemingly unconcerned by its proximity to human habitation. It paused near Linda's compost bin, sniffing the air curiously. Linda's first instinct was to panic, to call for help, or hide. But as she watched the bear, she felt an odd sense of calm settle over her. This wasn't the frenzied attack she had experienced before. This was nature going about its business. "Well, hello there," Linda found herself saying softly, though she knew the bear couldn't hear her through the closed window. "You're not here to cause trouble, are you?" As if in response, the bear turned its head, seeming to look directly at the house. For a moment, Linda felt as though those dark eyes were staring right into her soul. There was no malice in that gaze, no hunger or aggression, just a wild intelligence that Linda found both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the bear turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Linda stood at the window for a long time after the bear had gone, her mind whirling with conflicting emotions. Fear was there, of course. She doubted she would ever be entirely free of that after her attack. But there was also a sense of wonder and perhaps even a touch of the old reverence she had once felt for the wild creatures that shared her mountain home. As the day wore on, Linda found herself replaying the morning's events in her mind. She thought about her panic at the snapping twig, her flight back to the safety of the house, and she thought about the calm she had felt watching the bear from her window. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Linda made a decision. She couldn't continue living in fear, jumping at every sound and shadow. It was time to reclaim her life, her home, and her love for the wilderness that surrounded her. The next morning, Linda rose early. She packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and a first aid kit. Then, with Buddy at her side, she stepped off her porch and headed not for her garden, but for the hiking trail that led into the woods behind her property. Each step was a challenge. Every rustle of leaves made her pause. Every distant sound had her scanning her surroundings. But Linda pressed on, drawing strength from Buddy's calm presence and her own determination. As they walked, Linda found herself talking softly to Buddy, to herself, and to the forest around her. "We're part of this, aren't we, boy?" she mused as they paused by a babbling brook. "Part of this whole big, wild, beautiful world. Can't let fear take that away from us." They hiked for an hour before turning back, and by the time they returned home, Linda felt a shift in her perspective. The forest was still a place of potential danger, yes, but it was also a place of beauty, of life, of the wild spirit that had drawn her to Montana in the first place. Over the next few weeks, Linda gradually expanded her comfort zone. She spent more time in her garden, no longer fleeing at every unexpected sound. She took longer hikes with Buddy, reacquainting herself with the trails she had once known so well. And while she remained cautious and alert, she found that the paralyzing fear that had gripped her since the attack was slowly loosening its hold. One crisp autumn morning, as Linda stood on her porch sipping her morning coffee, she spotted movement at the edge of the woods. Her breath caught for a moment as she recognized the lumbering form of a bear. But this time, there was no panic, no frantic rush for safety. Instead, Linda stood her ground, watching calmly as the bear meandered along the tree line before disappearing back into the forest. As she turned to go back inside, Linda caught sight of her reflection in the window. The woman looking back at her was changed from the Linda of a few months ago. There were new lines on her face, a new wariness in her eyes, but there was also strength there, and a hard-won wisdom. Linda Harper had survived a bear attack. She had faced her fears, shared her story, and found a way to reclaim her life. As she stepped back into her house, Linda realized that while the scars of her encounter would always be with her, they were now a part of her story, not the end of it. Life in bear country would never be without its risks. But Linda had found a way to live with those risks, to respect the wild creatures that shared her home without being ruled by fear of them. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was a peace she could live with. And as she looked out at the mountains that had been her home for so long, Linda felt a sense of belonging wash over her. She was where she was meant to be, bear encounters and all,